Welcome to this session from the Institute of Modern Languages Research. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Arthur Rose, today from Bristol University / University of Exeter. This series, I'll just say a word on the series, and then I'll introduce Arthur, and then I will we'll start the session. Just a quick note: you should see subtitles. You may see subtitles coming up on your screen. You can turn them off by clicking on the closed captions button on the bottom of your screen. I think people are fairly used to these kinds of sessions by now, these online sessions by now, but I'll just talk a little bit about how the Q&A will work. So we've got the chat at the bottom of the screen, so you're very welcome to post in the chat throughout the session, questions, comments, and then we can pick those up in the Q&A. You're also welcome to raise your digital hand in the Q&A, and you can put a question live to our speaker. I think that's it for the technical bits and pieces. So Arthur is currently Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Bristol and a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter. And he's currently completing a book called Asbestos, the Last Modernist Object for Edinburgh University Press. And today, Arthur's kindly agreed to speak to us as part of a series that we've been running here at the RMLR called Confinement in French and Francophone Literature and Film. And Arthur's title today is What is Asbestos Quebecois Literature, Confinement and Resource in André Langevin's Poussière sur la ville and Cassie Bérard's Qu'il de se noyer. So Arthur, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. So why talk about asbestos, that carcinogenic mineral fiber, in a seminar series on confinement? Why, in particular, in relation to Quebecois literature? The second question is easy enough to answer. In 1949, around the peak of its production, Quebec produced 85% of the world's asbestos. Asbestos did not just evoke pride for Quebec, it was also a staging ground for debates around national sovereignty and national self-consciousness. The Asbestos miners' strike, also in 1949, has often been thought of as a watershed moment for modern Quebecois nationalism. The future Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, would call it a violent announcement that a new era had begun. But my first question, too, makes sense when we think of the prevailing presence of asbestos in the walls, the floors, and the ceilings of those spaces that currently confine us generally, our homes, classrooms, hospitals. And when we recall that this material presence is a legacy from a period when asbestos was meant to confine in its most liberatory sense. By protecting us from fire, it was meant to confine and thus relieve our fears about fire. Confines, after all, do not simply describe enclosures, but the material structures that facilitate enclosure itself. Accordingly, we might think of asbestos as the border meant to protect us from the fearful neighbor that turns out to be a fearful neighbor in its own right. In what follows, I want to relate the material confines offered by asbestos to the confinement of particular categories, like Quebecois literature, to the function of a particular trope of confinement that emerges in this literature, the asbestos mining town. This, I hope, will not simply gesture to the role of confinement in a selection of texts, but will offer some of the more enabling affordances of confinement, not, I should hasten to add, because we should be happy to be so confined, but simply because amidst the pain of confinement, we may well find a clarity about matters of existential import we can no longer afford to ignore. So, in Rosemary Chapman's 2013 study, What is Quebecois Literature?, Chapman develops a sophisticated account of the nature, function, dissemination, and impact of literary history, how literary history's nation-shaping function played out in the specific context of Francophone Canada, and how that was implemented through the methods of literary historians and the inclusion of a particular corpus in Canadian education systems through curriculum directives and in the content of textbooks and anthologies. The consequence, as Chapman finds, is a history marked as much by particular exclusions as inclusions, not simply of the low or middle brow or of Anglophone Quebec, but also ethnic, migrant, and Indigenous writing and regional literatures, or those Francophone literatures beyond Quebec. For this reason, she prefers the term Francophone Canadian literature. But her point, if I read her correctly, is not simply to dismiss the term littérature québécois, but to use it as a springboard for recognizing that it no longer holds as a single narrative. Indeed, she writes, it never did offer more than a selective and incomplete account of the literary production of Francophone writers in Canada. With this in mind, we might re-invoke the term while attending to its historical specificity. As Chapman notes, littérature québécois is only established as the accepted modern designation when Parti Pris published a special issue entitled Pour une littérature québécois in 1965. Prior to this moment, the accepted term in the literary histories of Camille Roy and Gérard Tougat is littérature canadienne française. Drawing on Chapman, we can then make explicit partiality that the term seems to erase, that by littérature québécois, we can designate texts that engage consciously or not with the conditions of and leading up to the Révolution tranquille, including the 1948 Refus Global Manifesto by Paul-Émile Bourgeois, the 1949 Asbestos Miners' Strike, and the sundering of the long-standing alliance between the Catholic Church and Quebec state government. In light of these conditions, what might an Asbestos Quebecois literature look like? It is because I think there is some profit in identifying that literature that I am taking up your time, despite, and here comes my apologia, despite not being a scholar of Quebecois, Francophone, or even French literature, and despite having a very limited reading ability in French, which, as you can already surmise, or you've already guessed, I imagine, it becomes almost non-existent when I'm speaking. For while scholars of Quebec have addressed the coincidence between asbestos literature, political economy, and national sovereignty in response to particular texts, I've not yet seen them strung together as a tradition that links textual production to political economy. This, despite the foundational role that the Asbestos Strike of 1949 would play in the mythography of the Quiet Revolution and the birth of modern Quebecois nationalism. The Asbestos Strike was a 4-month labor dispute, I should say, when miners from 4 major asbestos mines in Asbestos and Thetford mines walked off the job. Their demands included wage increases, holidays, union participation, and dust control. But it played a much more important role in reorienting the social fabric of Quebec. In the popular imagination, the miners, mainly French-speaking, were set up against foreign Anglophone asbestos companies from the UK and the US. The Quebec Premier at the time, Maurice Duplessis, sided with the companies while the church sided with the striking miners. The collusion between church and state that had marked the political landscape in Quebec for more than almost 100 years was significantly shaken. Indeed, as Jessica Van Horsen convincingly argues, the actual miners were largely forgotten in an event that took on mythic proportions. In what follows then, I want to think about how we might think of a partial littérature québécois emerging from the strike, either directly or indirectly. So within this admittedly porous containment strategy, we might direct our attention to those texts that build on the specific conditions of the 49 strike when we in referring to an asbestos Quebecois literature. Such a definition would be reflexive of its partiality, but would, by taking up the name of a political territory, seek to bring the text within its confines into a more explicit engagement with the political economy shaped by asbestos. In the meantime, we might actually look at what Asbestos, the town, looks like, and particularly its relationship with the mine, the Jeffrey mine, which, as you can see, and Jessica Van Horsen again has a very compelling graphic novel that literalizes the metaphoric eating of the town that you got on the part of the Jeffrey mine as it expanded over the course of the 20th century. So the idea is to sort of think about taking up the name of the political territory to then bring texts about asbestos, both the town and the substance, into a more explicit engagement with political economy. And the loose trajectory of texts that I'm thinking of runs from André Langevin's Poussière sur la ville, through Jean-Jules Richard's Le Feu dans l'amiante, to Cassie Bérard's Qu'il de ses noyer. So from Poussière sur la ville, 1953, Le Feu is 1956, and Bérard's novel is 2016. Briefly, Langevin gives an account of a mining town doctor who, when presented with his wife's infidelity in moments of controversial medical decision-making, finds it difficult to reconcile his own acceptance of these conditions with the expectations the townsfolk have of persons in authority. Richard gives a direct account of the conditions of the 49 strike, and in particular the wretched, exploited state of the workers who participated in it. And Bérard, in perhaps the most complex novel of the three, tells the story of Jacinthe and her investigation of a series of mysterious drownings around Asbestos, the town, set against the backdrop of the 2012 bailout. So the bailout in 2012, just to gloss that, is the Quebec government in 2012 promised a $58 million loan to reopen the mines that had ceased production in 2011. Yes, you might be surprised, but Canada was mining and exporting asbestos until 2012, and only signs the Rotterdam Agreement on the banning on the international banning of asbestos production after it ceases production, which is its own kind of interesting story. So the $58 million loan was meant to reopen the mines and restart operations for the next 20 years. When the political party that promised this lost power, however, the loan was subsequently cancelled, which effectively brought the asbestos industry in Quebec to an end. Bérard's text imagines the fallout of this cancellation. Langevin and Bérard usefully bracket Richard's more explicitly social realist concern by addressing the everyday social conditions around or just before the strike, and in those in the dying gasps of the asbestos industry. And for this reason, I'm going to leave Richard for another time, turning rather to the way that Langevin and Bérard texts play off the confinement of asbestos town culture, rather than exploiting, as Richard does, the explosive potential of that. They allow us to imagine a literary trajectory raised by the strike and continuing until the 2012 bailout, but they're not going to offer a history as such. For that, I heartily recommend Jessica Van Horsen's A Town Called Asbestos, whose findings inform much of my thinking here. Poussière sur la ville introduces us to Alain Dubois, a doctor recently arrived in the fictional town of Macklin with his wife, Madeleine. Macklin is an analogue for Thetford mines, and periodically a shower of asbestos dust will fall over the town to remind us, the readers, where we are. And yet, asbestos seemingly has little to do with this existentialist novel. Written in a lugubrious first person, the novel begins in medias, with Dubois just having been told by the local restaurateur that people have begun to talk about Madeleine and her nightly solo visits to his restaurant. Soon the shades of Bovarism will crystallize. Madeleine, like Emma Bovary, is a daydreamer whose life consisted, because I'm so terrible at reading French, I've decided to spare you the agony of hearing me malign the language any more than you already do. So I'm going to read the quotes in English, but I've supplied the English and the French for you. So she's a daydreamer whose life consisted of a series of brief, violent enthusiasms, followed by empty periods during which she remained astonishingly passive. But if Alain, like Charles, is the cuckolded doctor husband, this is not because he is oblivious to Madeleine's affair. Rather, it is because he too finds himself alienated from his life. This office, he reflects, couldn't possibly be mine, and the woman sleeping upstairs wasn't mine either. It was all a dream, and like a sleepwalker, I was about to wake up in a strange house. The moment I could almost see my new life, my marriage, and my doctor's office in this little town as a complete stranger might, as if I were coming back home after 20 years and could no longer recognize my wife or the house itself. Dubois' temporal dysphoria, with its evocations of an Odysseus returning to Ithaca, but one which he no longer remembers, sets the prevailing mood for his narrative. As we return to the moment when he and Madeleine arrive to establish his practice, and then follow the growing distance between them, her affair, and eventually her death by suicide. What makes this existential reimagining of Madame Bovary particularly significant is the way that it constructs the town as a collective consciousness that actively participates in the ensuing domestic tragedy. When the affair is revealed to Dubois, he seeks reprieve in whiskey, but more or less accepts this as part of Madeleine's nature. In parallel, he makes a series of controversial medical decisions that, although informed by modern medical science, appear to be at odds with the town's customs. Both the affair and the decisions occasion condemnation from the town. His patients leave, and the storekeeper, the local priest, and other doctors all communicate to him in no uncertain terms that by compromising yourself, you compromise all of us, and we will be obliged to give you up. Under the collective weight of the town's condemnation, Madeleine will be driven to suicide. Like the falling asbestos dust, Dubois' house of cards lay in dust. A large, unpitying hand had knocked it down. I waited for the dust to envelop me again, but my unrest prolonged itself. Nothing was settled. Dubois will be strongly advised to start again elsewhere, but will decide to stay. So ends the novel. Poussière sur la ville has been read productively, I think, as a comment on the difficulties that emerged when established cultural authorities began to lose their credibility in the wake of the 49 strike. The falling asbestos dust is not ominous because of its promise of illness, even though this awareness was there and was a direct concern of the strike. Rather, it ties the material of labor to the long-standing poetic association of dust with futility and death, to call into question the long-standing alliance between church and provincial state power, which frayed and eventually collapsed in the lead up to the Quiet Revolution. Julie Robert, for instance, finds in Dubois' abrogation of clinical authority signs of the discontent with customary authority. Of course, with the collapse of authority, the diagnostic tools these authorities use are revealed to be partial and suspect. This may well be why it is Dubois' effort to imagine himself 20 years in the future that proves so useful when thinking about the town's alienation from the new that awaits to be born. For Dubois, the confines of the town are not simply spatial boundaries that might simply be left behind. He would, after all, carry the ghost of Madeleine with him wherever he goes. Rather, they announce a kind of temporal stuckness that demands he stay despite them, but which, if there was any hope in the novel at all, there might be the possibility of changing in the future. This optimism is all the more evident when we set Poussière sur la ville as the beginning of a trajectory that culminates with Bérard's novel. Written in free and direct discourse, but predominantly focalized through Jacinthe and occasionally her friend Jasmin. Bérard's novel begins with a drowning incident involving 3 children near the town of Asbestos. The mystery of the incident will be the preoccupation of Jacinthe, who has come to Asbestos to look for answers about her own brother's disappearance. Auguring the difficult answers that await, we first encounter Jacinthe in a conversation with a mechanic. She has hit a deer on her way into Asbestos, severely damaging her car. So again, we have the figure of an outsider trapped in the town by circumstance. And yet, as my mention of Jacinthe's brother has already suggested, Jacinthe is no stranger. Her grandparents were from the town, and she decides to rent their old house, which she begins to explore in the vain hope of finding some trace of what happened to her brother. As I've already said, the stories of the brother's disappearance and the mysterious drownings occur against the backdrop of a general anxiety about the 2012 bailout. After Jacinthe's first night in her grandparents' house, she emerges to a traffic jam that recurs daily as local people wait for the possibility of work from the mine. The mechanic's shop, Jacinthe will find, is closed because the mechanic is periodically also trying to find work with the mine. And as Jacinthe's investigation continues, so too will anxieties about the bailout build, eventually culminating in rumors that it will not go through, the confirmation of these rumors, protests, and as a result, a catastrophic collapse as parts of the town and the townspeople fall into the mine's void. This tendency of the Jeffrey mine to eat bits of asbestos is not new, as I've already hinted at. Jessica Van Holsen has documented similar invasions, and indeed Bérard mentions a particular notorious occasion in the 1970s. But here, of course, we must recall that Bérard is hazarding a comparison with the cave-ins in Zola's Germinal, a significant intertext for the novel, wherein, at a stroke, the lives of many can be simply snuffed out. As the protest grows, the groanings of the earth become more ominous until eventually the ground begins to crack. As the event begins, so Bérard pulls us into Jacinthe's experience, insisting on limited third-person experience of the onlooker trying to absorb the trauma of the roaring earth, the noise, and the black and grey sky. Quote, "The howls are silent in the heaviness of the sky. The crowd no longer resembles a crowd. Fewer and fewer crowds. The crowd disappears, carried away. Earth explodes, rocks by the thousands suspended in the air, fire. Earth explodes, and as Jacinthe stretches out her hands towards the crowd slips, the whole expands, the trees, the boulevard swallowed ahead, the world turns into a vast night." So the repetitions of La Foule and La Terre offer a stop-motion effect, wherein, as a result of the repeated explosions, both crowd and earth become successively less and less and less, or fewer and fewer and fewer, disappearing even as Lettre also repeated, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, transforming the world into a vast night. But here there is no sovereign on whom to blame the catastrophe, or rather the entire history of asbestos has been one where every miner in pursuit of a better life has had to become their own sovereign. Following the disaster, the novel turns to its final section, repairing the damage. But if anything, this attempt at repairing the damage proves even more troubling. For here, amidst the efforts to pick up the pieces of the town, we come to realize that the conditions leading up to Jacinthe's investigation suggest a fundamental breakdown in our ability to trust her as a focalizer. which we might also kind of add is interestingly the focus of Bérard's PhD thesis on kind of free and direct discourse. Through the novel, she recalls her and her brother running around on the mine dumps. This then corresponds to scenes of her coughing to suggest that she too has been exposed to asbestos and is showing the first signs of an asbestos-related disease. These correspondences have their denouement when a worker points out that the asbestos in her grandparents' house's attic, scene which culminates in his having a coughing fit. So I have always stayed away from the mine, the worker interposes. And saying this, he is seized with a violent coughing fit, which forces him to punch his chest with his fists. The three raise their eyes towards the frame. It is feared that in the madness of the suffocation, the body will tip over, but nobody wants to climb up there. Nobody. Vermiculite, no thanks. I have always stayed away from the mine. The problem is that the mine, whatever you do, never leaves you alone. The mine never leaves you alone, so too the meaning of the grey skies in the wake of the tragedy, raining dust over the city. But here dust carries more than the simple poetic implications of futility and death that it did for Langevin. Here it has a well-established causal link to death, as Bérard explains. For this reason, I think, Bérard chooses to explore the accidental nature of this death, not as we might expect through Toussaint's emerging symptoms, but by building towards the culminating accident of the mine's collapse and punctuating this development with episodic accounts of the various mysterious drownings. Effectively, this shifts our focus from a concern which we already imagine we understand well, the causal relation between asbestos and disease, to the undervalued role of hazard in determining who is and who is not caught up by the disease. To develop this, we find, almost as a counterpoint to Bérard's naturalist homage to Zola, an overt channeling of Mallarmé, in particular in Queue de Dé. Dice games proliferate through the narrative. Indeed, in the final hallucinatory moments of the book, perhaps imagined, perhaps recollected, when we see that it is actually Toussaint who visited the children whose drowning opened the book on the day of the drowning and was supposed to be in charge of them or caring for them, that the narrative will not close by resolving whether she was or was not party to the drowning. It will close on the four of them playing a dice game together. When will it end? One of the children asks. If we're lucky, it never ends. She answers. In a brilliant essay that links Bérard's novel and the broader topic of Canadian extractivism to the horror genre, Isabelle Courroux-Massicotte has argued that the book intersects with the use of horror as a genre of world literature, its small locked-in town proving the analogue of the haunted Maine towns of Stephen King. Certainly, that analogue is confirmed when we think of the way in which other asbestos towns and mines have been represented. Wittenoom in Western Australia, Prieska in South Africa, Libby, Montana, Balangero in northern Italy, Asbest in the Urals, just to name those that are perhaps the most well-known. But a more local Quebec tradition can be discerned when we track our way back from Bérard to Langevin. When we try to identify a structure of feeling in Raymond Williams's sense of the term, it would be the etiolated hope offered by asbestos as the compromised means of realizing a community and holding that community together. It is the bedrock which Dubois contests his relationship with the town. It is the last hope, as far as Toussaint can see, to keep the town together. That this is always a compromise can be seen in Langevin as much as Bérard, even if we must wait until Bérard to truly appreciate what that compromise was. Un refus global, Paul-Émile Bourgeois begins by imagining a little people trapped by circumstance, tradition, geography, that might pursue a rupture where, quote, a new collective hope will be born. The passionate agitation to make way for magic, for objective mysteries, for a future of possibilities, bears a striking resemblance to the promise enshrined in the promotional literature of asbestos industries that asbestos would be the material of the future. Now, I'm not suggesting that Bourtois had asbestos in mind, though indeed he might well have foreseen the cynical doctor that he excoriates in the manifesto come to be manifested in the figure of Alain Dubois. Rather, I want to suggest that the confined asbestos town, as it appears in Langevin and Bérard, serves as a common springboard for launching a more qualified account on how such collective hopes might be born. By way of a coda, I want to turn now to a last text, if I may stretch your patience so far. Louise Penny's 2014 detective novel, The Long Way Home. As you might surmise, and apologies for the spoilers, the novel's key conceit turns on exposure to asbestos. Penny's protagonist, Chief Inspector Armand Gamache, formerly of the Sûreté du Québec, has been asked by his friend, an artist, to find her husband, also an artist. As he delves into Canada's art world, he uncovers a plot whose tendentiousness has to make it one of the most absurd methods of murder of any police procedural I've yet read. His friend's relationship is framed by a decades-long rivalry between two of their teachers. Indeed, they have separated in some senses because their art practice diverges precisely on the point of philosophical difference between these two teachers. One of these teachers has, with a slow cunning to match Rob Nixon's slow violence, been sending the other art supplies, blank canvases, for decades in containers contaminated with small amounts of asbestos, harvested from the art college's decaying infrastructure. The tendentiousness of this particular murder plot turns on the fact that the exposure has occurred over decades, that asbestos diseases similarly take decades to develop, especially when exposure is so slight, and even then, in many cases, exposure does not lead to disease. Indeed, even though the rival does eventually develop mesothelioma, this ultimately does not kill him. Aware of Gamache's investigation, the other teacher panics, travels to finish the job by the more conventional approach of slitting his rival's throat. What, you will be forgiven for wondering, has this to do with my argument about Quebecois literature? Well, we might take a first stab at this question by noting that although Penny herself is from Ontario, she lives in the eastern townships of Quebec, is a member of the Order of Quebec, and writes about Quebec. Certainly, the notion of an Anglophone Quebecois literature remains a somewhat contentious topic, but only because from Francis Brooks' 1769 work, The History of Emily Montagu, to Jan Martel's 2002 Man Booker winner, The Life of Pi, there are enough examples of Anglophone literary works written in Quebec to warrant a category at all. And as Graham Wynne has noticed, The Long Way Home pays particular attention to the opposition between the bucolic village life of Gamache's home and the scarred landscapes left as a legacy of Quebec's mining history. But if Penny's police procedural offers itself as the crime fiction equivalent to Bérard's horror in opening up a world literature, it ultimately fails, I think, to attain the structure of feeling I'm associating with an asbestos Quebecois literature. Ultimately, for Penny, there are two Quebecs: the beautiful village where Gamache lives and the heart of darkness Quebec, where asbestos mining takes place. Penny attempts to bring these two Quebecs into meaningful dialogue to heal their division as if with a balm out of Gilead. This fails ultimately because the sick Quebec of asbestos mining is not, or not really, the true Quebec for Penny. It is the aberration that must be healed or written over or solved. And this perhaps explains why the asbestos that Penny uses as a murder weapon is not, or not directly, from any Quebec mine. It has run the full gamut of the production line, passing through the factory into the infrastructure of the art college, and only then into the murdering transportation tubes. Penny's work then serves as a foil to what the works of Langevin, Richard, and Bérard do in reckoning with Quebec's complex relation with asbestos, a structure of feeling that developed after the strike that rails against the confinement of the politics of small-town Quebec, while also perceiving dimly the hopes and opportunities this small town offers. Only by sitting in the confines of such small towns, perhaps, can we really understand how, within the confines of a category insulated by a known carcinogen and delineated by the little rectangles through which we see so many of our loved ones today, we play our dice games, hoping they will never end, hoping indeed that such games do not abolish chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for a really stimulating talk. I have lots of questions myself, but I'm kind of conscious to open the floor. I'd like to, as I said at the beginning, invite people, just remind people that you can raise your hands by clicking at the bottom of the screen, I believe on reactions, and then you could post in the chat if you have a question. I can put it to Arthur, or you can let us know that you have a question, and then you can put it to Arthur yourself. Perhaps I'll start, and then people can kind of reflect on their questions. Arthur, thank you for that really fascinating talk, and an account of a place I've never actually heard of. I just wondered. I mean, I know you said you weren't going to focus on the history of the place, Asbestos, but I just wondered, could you say a bit more about how it got its name, Asbestos? I'm quite curious about that. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the naming thing, right? Because it's just changed its name.
Right. Okay.
To Val de La? No. But basically, yeah, it's just changed its name.
Val des Sources, yeah.
Yeah,
Elizabeth in the chat. Val des Sources. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And there's been, like, it's interesting how that discussion has gone as it sort of progressed, because it was not a, I mean, the decision to change the name was not taken lightly, right? They didn't kind of end asbestos production and then change the name immediately. There was kind of feeling that it was an important legacy of the industry and things like that. And I mean, that, I think what's really kind of beautiful and valuable about one of the things that's really beautiful in Jessica's book is precisely how she unpacks how it was always this real, like, complex kind of process of compromise, and it's not a kind of case of innocent miners not knowing things. It's a much more complicated history, and part of that history is, in fact, the decision to name the town Asbestos after the mineral, which again has also been done in asbest in the in the Urals, right? So it's not just the kind of like one place that has chosen to do this, and in some ways I think it does reflect a certain dynamic of something that's kind of disappeared, which is the notion of the kind of the company town, right? And you can think of like Bourneville, for instance, which is set up by the Cadbury company to house its workers. The reason why I'm kind of treading into this area that I don't, one would quite rightly ask, why is it that I'm treading into this area that I don't really speak the language and I don't really know that much about Quebec. Why am I talking about this? My reasons are because I'm from South Africa and my father grew up on an asbestos company town, and in some ways the asbestos company town built in each different location, they built a kind of community spirit that is almost impossible to try to recover in most kind of discussions of asbestos, right? So it's kind of because it's such a fraught topic in terms of larger kind of questions of political economy. This kind of community element of why it is that a town would be proud enough about its product to actually make that its name kind of gets lost. And so in some ways, the reason why I'm talking to you precisely because I'm interested in how the kinds of structures of feeling that emerge that produce that. So I've not really answered your question by telling you what it is that history is. Rather, I've kind of tried to outline why it is that people might have done that in the first place, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Arthur. I see Craig Moyes got a hand up. You should be able to unmute yourself, Craig. So Craig, you're muted.
There we are. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Arthur. That was really, really fascinating, and it's a topic I hadn't thought much about, but it's really clearly. I mean, I hadn't thought much about it except in terms of the famous strike, Pierre Trudeau, Pelletier, all those really important people that were formed in the crucible of asbestos. In a lot of ways, but and so I feel slightly uneasy asking a question here because I've read neither of these novels. But your remarks on the place of the company town and your earlier remarks on asbestos as a type of figuration of nationalism in Quebec got me thinking that there is one document that is, of course, really important in the, if you like, the larger literature of asbestos, and that's Jutras' Mon Oncle Antoine. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'd never really. I mean, it begins by, if I remember correctly, with an intertitle saying, in Quebec, not so long ago, in asbestos country.
Yeah.
And then the story takes off, and it really is. But the asbestos itself, I mean, as a material, as a carcinogen, doesn't really figure all that much. It's very much the company town and the how do you say, the recueillement, the coming together around the notion of family as another figure for the nation. So that's one thing that I'd be interested to see how that perhaps played out in these two novels on either side, because that Mon Oncle Antoine is 70, 71, something like that, and your first novel was mid-50s, and this latest one is quite recent, isn't it? So it's sort of right in the middle. And the other thing is the way that another industry came to figure the nation. I mean, asbestos could have been one of the sort of major figurations of the nation. So I'm not sure if it was any more or less important than forestry, for example. But in the 1960s, it's hydroelectricity and the dam that becomes the mega industrial pole around which nationalism is focused in Quebec. And anyway, I just thought those aren't really questions, more comments, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
No, that's a great point about my uncle. Is that because of course that is I think what I am trying, I guess, to suggest is that if you somehow were to take those scenes where asbestos is foundational format, but actually is altogether absent from the text. I mean, in some ways, that's exactly what Langevin does, right? Because it's actually nothing to do with asbestos. Every so often you'll get this kind of idea of dust falling down. As there's a kind of explosion in the mine, the dust falls over the town, but otherwise there's no real exploration of what it actually means, even though this guy's a doctor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it just kind of creates the Stimmung, if you will, of like what, it's like this joke that, well, it could have been anything, but it just so happens it's all about asbestos, and it just so happens that asbestos did this thing, that asbestos is linked to kind of this foundational event that gets like retrospectively mythologized as the foundational moment in modern day Quebec, right? So it really is to sort of suggest, I guess, in Raymond Williams's way of like that when you pass these kind of instances of undiagnosed asbestos together, they do create a kind of structure of feeling in which key texts for articulating a kind of national self-consciousness become linked to this material, right? And I guess what I guess is kind of interesting, and one of the points that I was thinking of making, this relates to your second point, why asbestos, or how does that jibe against other industries? The thing that I'm interested in, I guess, is why it is that the energy humanities, which obviously have a really strong presence in Canadian academia at the moment, haven't thought about or haven't really seemed to turn back to asbestos. I mean, what is that? It's very much about Alberta and the tar sands and things like that, right? But and I think the significance is actually in a kind of insignificance, right? Because actually what makes asbestos so interesting to think about is precisely that it shouldn't have played such an integral role in shaping Quebec self-identity, right? Because actually it was a really small amount of the industry. Very few people, relatively speaking, were employed by the industry. It was like a fraction of GDP. It was, and most of the money was going out to the UK, to Turner Brothers, or to John Manville in the US. So why this industry? And I think the interesting thing is, although it was a small part of Quebec's economy, Quebec could claim an outsized role in the world because it was producing 85% of the world's asbestos, right? So it's like that in some ways it was also a way of selling Quebec to the rest of the world, and that in a sense made it quite a useful situation to make that strike, the 49 strike, so kind of fundamental, which I think, and here you'll excuse me if I use a slide that I the kind of in the lower sort of side, there's this board game. You won't see what the name of the board game is, but it's actually called Trudeaumania, spelt true as in TRUE, dough as in DOUGH, mania, playing on the big kind of Trudeaumania that Pierre Trudeau developed. And it's a really kind of funny, like right-wing kind of anti-liberal party type of board game that is rightfully forgotten in the 1980s, right? But what it does, I think, talk about is the way that what it does sort of suggest is the way in which the asbestos strike becomes important for modes of Quebec nationalism, which then also jibe against the sort of fight between the nationalists and Trudeau later, and then it just becomes this pawn that kind of gets recycled between them. The trades on Trudeau's name, the trades on various other figures that become famous because of it, and actually leaves the miners behind completely, so that it just becomes a symbolic imaginary object that never really gets dealt with. I don't know if any of those things, I've kind of rambled a bit, well, a lot. I don't know if any of those kind of speak to some of the things that you were thinking of.
Yeah, no, and actually, I noticed that Elizabeth Robinson has mentioned something about the way the Anglo-Franco tensions were channeled certainly through the asbestos strike, and I think part of that is I don't know if she agrees with me or not, but the part of that is really shown, highlighted by a film like Mon Oncle Antoine, where it's really more those tensions are also sort of superimposed upon a class struggle with the Quebecois proletarian and the Anglo bosses as the patriarchs.
Yeah, that's great. I just saw the chat. I'm sorry for not responding, Elizabeth. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Arthur. I'm conscious that there is good chat in the chat. So I wanted to kind of invite Elizabeth. If you'd like to comment, please do feel free to come on, or Rachel for that matter. Both of whom have posted in the chat.
Can I say something? I can't see myself, but I don't know if you can see me.
We can see you. Yep.
Hello, Rachel.
Hi. Just to say that there's a very good documentary by Desjardins, Richard Desjardins, about the mining industry in northern Quebec, and it has the workers, the bosses, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and all that kind of thing into it, and it kind of combines footage. Some of it's contemporary to the early 20th century, and then some of it's more recent. It all ties in, of course, with this stuff about forestry as well. But it might be something worth having a quick look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Was there anyone else who wanted to ask a question? You can raise your hand, or you can just kind of unmute yourself and speak, as we're not that many today, so it's absolutely fine. Arthur, I wondered if I could. I was conscious we had a brief chat before we came on and talked about your book, and you said that this was something that you considered including in the book, and then felt that you probably wouldn't use it eventually. I just wondered how these texts related to the other texts that you look at in the book. I wondered how they relate. Is there a certain kind of, is there a certain kind of Quebecois singularity or uniqueness to these texts that made them kind of not fit within the book? Curious about that.
Yeah, so I should sort of reframe it. What I meant to say is actually these books are in the book, but that I hadn't really done them justice as Quebecois literature before. So that when you asked me whether I'd consider embarrassing myself in this way, I kind of then thought, oh, well, I'll just extract some stuff from the book. And then I realized that actually the way in which I've structured the book is not it's primarily it's a literary critical book. So the aim was to actually avoid fixing too much on a particular place or on a particular historical trajectory. So in the end, what I found is that they've kind of been like when I look at it in the book, the book is divided into 3 sections, and the first section is how do we come to the topic of asbestos? What kind of predispositions, or I kind of use Ricoeur's kind of work from Time and Narrative. What kind of prefigurations do we have when we assume that we know what asbestos is? And I argue that actually you can use 3 genres to identify those prefigurations. If you want to kind of broadly divide them into the 2 styles of historical research that have been done, right? The one way of doing that is that you think of asbestos as offering a kind of utopia answer to things that eventually becomes a kind of dystopia. The other way of thinking about it is that it's a mystery that you can either solve either through a detective novel like Louise Penny, or what I think is significantly more interesting, not solve through a kind of horror novel to maybe over kind of emphasize the generic elements of Bérard's novel, right? Once one's kind of worked out how one always assumes a kind of utopian, dystopian, or mystery kind of aspect to asbestos, one's in a much better position to start to think about how you might deal with 3 types of, I guess, incommensurabilities that have occurred to me when one's talking about asbestos, which is, what is it? What does it do to us? And how do we respond to the fact that it does these things to us? And so in terms of what it is, I kind of remember the fact that in early modern science, everybody thought that asbestos came from salamanders. And I use the fact that it kind of, there's this association between asbestos and salamanders as a kind of infrastructure for thinking about why it is that we always have this kind of ontological indeterminacy in our responses to asbestos. I kind of think about illness narratives and why it is that illness kind of, when asbestos causes an illness, it causes us to go into these kind of paroxysms about what it's done to us, what the causal relations are, which are often very temporally disconnected and become quite difficult to suture together. And then possibly the most interesting is you all, of course, know that Franz Kafka owned an asbestos factory. And so then I use the fact that Franz Kafka owned an asbestos factory to think about why it is that compensation claims that compensation can be the equivalent of justice kind of lead to an inherent necessary aporia around questions of justice that are kind of informed by Kafka's texts, right? And then the third section is really to then, if we've done this work, we've thought about where it comes from, what assumptions we've got when we think about asbestos, what ways we have through literature of trying to suture together its kind of problems, as it were. What happens if we then go back to the places that we find asbestos, so the mine, the factory, our homes, or the dump, and rather than take the cultural geographic approach of exploring those meanings in and of themselves, you kind of add in the presumptions, the prefigurations of genre, and the ways in which it's always kind of literature's battling with incommensurability to try to kind of jazz things up. And that kind of means that when you try to talk about asbestos mining towns, you're always kind of grappling with the problem of the expert who becomes less and less trustworthy as the histories become more and more demonstrate that experts are in collusion with the mine bosses or whatever. How factories kind of generate strikes and moments of anger. How our attempt to kind of make sense of asbestos in our homes kind of rubs up against precisely this idea of a kind of communal spirit, things like that. So, sorry, this was kind of impromptu, like second paper. I apologize for it. Hopefully it hasn't been a waste of your time. But I guess the point that I'm making is that these texts end up answering to a much more theoretical kind of argument of what it is that asbestos is or does, all kind of figured around this idea that my grandfather was an asbestos mine manager. And if I was to have a conversation with him today, how would I navigate that conversation knowing what it is that I do know about asbestos? And what would I say would be the ways of kind of rehabilitating that conversation with the emphasis on maintaining a relationship despite, perhaps disagreeing with fundamentally with what he chose to do with his life? I don't know, that's probably a bit deep and heavy, right? But does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense, and I can see how it's quite a kind of it gives us a sense of why you're doing this, but also I think I'm certainly looking forward to reading the book once it's out. So I see Craig's got your hand up again.
Yeah,
Craig. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, no. That what you just said. It does seem like Kafka is the way to go during those family conversations. But I just again, it's a sort of slightly random comment. I've been recently working on Expo 67, and one thing it's a fact I discovered, which I just parked to one side and has risen in my consciousness again because of your talk. If you look at the map of Expo 67 on all the islands, and of course, it's a series of industrial pavilions and national pavilions and theme pavilions on these islands in the middle of the St. Lawrence. On the Ile Notre Dame, where the big national pavilions were, where the Canadian pavilion was, the Quebec pavilion, the Western Provinces pavilions, the Atlantic Provinces pavilions, the Ontario pavilions, they were all sort of around a bit of a lagoon. And the middle of the lagoon was a little island called La Place de l'Amiante, Asbestos Place. And so, it was interesting. And so each of these provinces clearly had some relation to this, but it had a clear physical presence within this sort of Canadian, this stylized and sort of individualized Canadian space, provincial, federal space, which I haven't begun to work out yet, but I thought that was quite an interesting observation.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Do you mind if I steal that and put it in the book?
Go ahead. I'll send you the map if you like.
Please. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. I'm conscious, Arthur, we've kept you quite long already and given you a good grilling. So I'm conscious we should try to wrap up the session. Unless there are any last final questions. If not, I can happily wrap up. No? Okay, forever hold your peace then. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk and for the insight into the book that you're writing, that you've written. And when is it coming out? Please tell us.
So I'm kind of finalizing the the sort of first draft. So I'll submit it at the end of end of April, and then it should be May next year. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Elizabeth, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you everyone, and thank you Arthur, and thanks everyone for such a stimulating discussion. And yes, we look forward to seeing you in the flesh as soon as we can again. So, but nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Joe, for hosting.
Thanks very much, Craig. Cheers.
Thank you so much.